change in leadership are we looking for? The kind we had 4 years ago. Okay, well, what did we have 4 years ago?
Peace.
Peace? Okay. Security?
Somebody that cared about the actual people. We worked to make sure that, we weren't struggling to make ends meet.
Okay, so someone who cared about the people, someone who could help you out, help, we're all struggling right now to make the ends meet. Okay. Anything else? I know you guys have studied the book of Jonah before, and I think everybody is familiar with the story of Jonah, right? Imagine yourself in Nineveh, and let's just say that you're a person who believed in God. Or maybe you didn't, but you knew how the government of Nineveh and the way it carried out its day-to-day practices was just horrible. Life was hard. You had a tyrant for a leader, and you had people who didn't really value life. What kind of turnaround might you be looking for? In Nineveh.
Someone who's not a tyrant, who actually cares about the welfare of the people they
Okay. So a non-tyrant, someone who's a leader who cares about the people. Okay. You imagine people praying? Okay. To Yahweh, to the various pagan gods of Nineveh. Throughout time, God's people have cried out for help. The 400 plus years of being in Egypt, I imagine there was a time when the people were longing for God to deliver. And then when the plague started happening, you could almost hear the song revving up, God's up to something. You start seeing the gods of Egypt crumble, and you start seeing what God says is going to happen. Question, how did the people of Israel know that it was God, Yahweh, up to something, and not one of the Egyptian gods? The prophet? The prophet. Who was the prophet? Who was God's prophet? That came to Moses, right? So Moses, up on the wilderness, sees a bush that's burning but not burning. Something's going on. He gets his attention. He goes over. Yahweh, God tells him through the burning bush, take off your sandals, for where you are is holy ground. So he's listening. And then God begins to tell him, I've seen the misery, I've heard their cries, I know their situation, I'm going to deliver them. How is God going to deliver them? Through the prophet, right? I'm sending you to go talk to Pharaoh. Moses made excuses, right? And for every excuse, God had an answer. But Moses still had a choice to make, to go or not. By going and speaking up the words that God gave him to speak, Israel began to know that God was up to something. Because they met out in the wilderness for a few days, remember? Before all of that happened. And he said, look, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has spoken to me. Because at the bush, he says, who am I going to tell to send me? And he says, the only God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. The God of covenant. The God who made the covenant with Abraham that I'm going to deliver my people. And your people are going to live in the promised land. But they're going to spend time in a land not their own for a long time, until the time is ready. So he goes and tells them all this. And then the plagues start happening. After each plague, you got to think, God's up to something. But then there was a delay again. Because each time Pharaoh said, go, I stay. Go, stay. Go, stay. The people were ready to go. But Pharaoh wasn't ready to let them go. Then obviously the 10th plague comes along, and it's a plague against the firstborn. Right? And then he says, fine, get out of here, leave. God was up to something. They get to the Red Sea. It's closed. They've got mountains beside them, sea behind them, and the army of Egypt buried down in front of them. Or behind them. They had nowhere to go. But God was up to something. He spread the ocean apart. God was up to showing them, yes, I am the God who delivers you. Moses is my spokesperson, but I am the God that parts the seas. I am the God that you follow by fire by night and cloud by day. I'm the God that tabernacles with you. Where I go, you follow. God was up to something. He was building a people. He was building a nation and helping them to see they've been in bondage for so long, they've got to come to know who He is again and become a people that learn to depend on Him and understand He's up to something. There's no food, there's no water. God, why'd you bring us out here to die? God was up to something. What was He up to?
Depend on Him.
Depend on Him, absolutely. Depend on Him for water, depend on Him for manna. Get just enough in the morning for your family. Don't get to double, because what's going to happen if you get double? Better remember? It's going to get worms, it's going to destroy, it's going to go bad. So just get enough for each day. So God's teaching them to depend on Him each day for their daily bread. The same thing He teaches us in John chapter 6. Right? When He talks about the prayer, ask to God, give us this day our daily bread. He's talking to Egyptians, they would be Israelites, they would have understood that. God's up to something. Jesus is up to something by telling you to depend on Him for your daily bread. There's a connection between the old and the new. Make sense so far? God's up to something. Now, when we get over to Jonah, I'm going to go back to Jonah, and we'll skip forward again in a minute. When we get to Jonah, can you click on it one time? The cursor, there we go. The first step to turning things around is to acknowledge where we are and how we got there. The Israelites had to understand we're in bondage originally because there was a famine in the land. Joseph had gone ahead of them as a slave, right? Then the brothers come, and then daddy comes, and they start having families and they grow. They're there. But when it gets to the point of the deliverance, they had to acknowledge something. They couldn't do it on their own. At the Red Sea, they couldn't make it dry up. At the Jordan River, they couldn't make it dry up. But if you want to turn things around, you have to acknowledge where you are. Right? That's true in life. Whether you mentioned earlier, you'd like to have new leaders as a country. You'd like to have leaders who understand your predicament, who come in to help you. What's the likelihood of that happening? Throughout history, right? Sometimes you'll get one that's good for the people, but most of the time, governments end up taking care of themselves, do they not? Which is consistent with what God says in 1 Samuel chapter 8. When they come to Samuel, and then they come to, and Samuel goes to God and says, hey, look, the people are rejecting you as their king. Where you restore? He said, give us a leader like the nations. And God says in 1 Samuel chapter 8, let's go ahead and turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 8. We'll be back in Jonah in just a minute. We'll start in Jonah in a minute. But 1 Samuel chapter 8. These days, I may have to quit using the Bible my grandmother gave me. But it still work a little bit. Okay, so verse 6. But when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, listen to all the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. They have done so from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do. Okay? Samuel told all the words to the Lord of the people who were asking for a king, and he said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will do." Tell me if this sounds familiar. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, in other words, in his army. And they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest. And still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your maidservants, men servants and maidservants, and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you on that day. Did you catch that last part? You will cry out for relief from the king, what? You have chosen, but the Lord will not hear. Previously, the Lord was their king. And when they cried out for water, when they cried out for food, what did he give them? Food and water. Their clothing did not wear out all the time they were in the wilderness. Their shoes did not wear out while they were in the wilderness. When battles came, victories were there when they were faithful, following their king and their God. But somewhere along the way, Israel decided it'd be better to have our hopes and our dreams and our future in the hands of a president, of a dictator, of a king, of a parliament like the nations around us. Do you see what's happening here? What's happening? Yes, ma'am. Do we do that today as a people? Yes, we do. So if we want God to turn things around, we need to acknowledge who we need to rely on. The answer is not going to come through the president. God may use him, but most likely it's not. Because what he just said is this is what they're doing. They're going to take everything away from you. You're going to work for them. How much of your time and energy and effort that you do every day goes into the taxes you pay? A lot. Somebody said a few minutes ago, it was made, robbing Peter to pay Paul, basically, is the analogy you were given, right? And you have to give, and you give everything you got to the government, to the leader. Is that not what happens now? In a lot of ways? How did we get there? We know how Israel did. How did God's people get there? Following God's law? Okay. How did mankind, how did Christian mankind, Christian men and women get to the point where if we're honest as a people, maybe not you, but as a collective group, where we rely more on the president and what happens in D.C. than we do God?
But God is direct. The way I feel, God directs that whoever's in power.
Absolutely, which means when Obama and Clinton and Trump and Bush were president, that God orchestrated that, according to Romans 13.
We forget that we are not citizens of this world.
Yes, ma'am. We forget that we're not citizens of this world. I believe that we have the same issue that the Israelites did, that our citizenship became here.
I think all too often we just, whatever's going on in the world, we just let it go. We just let it happen. We don't stand for it. We don't politic against it. We don't, whatever you want to call it. But all too often and then everybody just caves into it and allows it to happen.
Okay.
I think that's where we start drawing further and further away from God. And that's when God takes us down. It's no different than them, the false
They began to rely on the other, right? Instead of God, instead of on Yahweh. So the first step in turning things around, we know from Jeremiah 29, right? That if my people who are called by my name will repent, turn from their wicked ways, then, and cry out to me, then I will heal their land. He's not talking to the people of Babylon. He's talking to who? The Israelites. Who are they? God's people. So when God, in principle, speaks today, is he referring to any nation other than his people, which is the ecclesia, the children of Israel, the children of Abraham, spiritual Israel, what we would call the church? Is he talking to anybody else other than the church about healing the land? He says, if who? If my people. So if the land's going to be healed, according to Jesus, according to God, Yahweh, in Jeremiah 29, if the land's going to be healed, it's dependent upon who doing what?
God's people.
God's people.
Turning to him, crying unto him.
Yes. God's people turning to him and crying out to him. Turning to him as what? You're right. But what does that mean? Turn to him as what? Our King. Yes, ma'am. He is our Lord and our God, which is what Thomas says in the Gospels, right? My Lord, my King, and my God. The same King he was in Samuel 8. God's always been the King. But the people began to rely on the kings of the earth. Modern rulers. They're there to carry out God's plan, right? And sometimes God uses Babylon to spank his people. And then sometimes God uses other countries to deliver his people. So the first step towards turning things around is acknowledging where we are and how we got there. That's true as a nation. It's true as individuals. All of us at some point in our life have gotten somewhere like, how in the world did I get here? Why did I do this? What decision did I make? And it's trying to figure out, okay, what do I got to do to turn things around? You got to acknowledge where you are so you know where to turn. Get your footing, get your foundation so you can begin to make a move, a shift. What types of things make it hard for us to admit what's really going on when things aren't going well? So what makes it hard to say, you know what, this is why it's bad when things aren't going well? What makes it hard to say, to own up to what it is? Our pride. Couldn't have said it better, Megan. Our pride gets in the way.
When things get comfortable.
What's that?
We get comfortable.
We get comfortable. You ever been comfortably uncomfortable? It's just almost like it's going to take too much effort to change anything, so just ride it out. You ride a wave long enough, yes, sir?
We tend to take the easy way out so many times.
We do. But the easy way out when it comes to this ends up being a mess. Anybody ever been boogie boarding or surfing? No? Okay. You have? Okay. So I've boogie boarded before, and I've shared this with people in the past. It's fun to ride a wave, to catch up on a big wave and ride it, cut down the side, feel the power, and the water splashing around you. You're not going as fast as you think. You're already taking flying into the water, right? And eventually, you ride it long enough, it takes you all the way up to the beach, right? But there's some waves, like the one I caught in Huntington Beach years ago, that's between 8 to 10 feet. It's a big wave. And it pulls you up, and you get excited. Oh, this is awesome. But I forgot to cut down the side of the wave and ride it as it's, taking its power and going with it. Does that make sense? You've seen surfers on a surfboard before, the videos? Well, if we're riding on top, what happens to a wave as it begins to turn over? It just keeps going. It crashes everything in its way. And I got pile drive to the bottom of the ocean, sand all up my britches and everything. And I had to admit, if I had just turned and gone down the side, I'd have been okay. If I had turned and gone down the side. A lot of times we get caught up riding the wave of our culture, the wave of our Christian culture, and we don't turn to follow where Christ has taken us. And that wave is going to flow over us, it's going to spank us hard. But as we ride it out, the imagery here, I wish I put a video up. the imagery of this writing it out is God taking us all the way to where He said He'd take us, back to the land. And we try to do it our way, and we just kind of, woo, there's a crash coming. Okay, so, next thing. So we're going to look at Jonah chapter 1 through 3. I want you to look at, if you don't mind, those 3 verses, just what he observed, and what about it, and how can you relate to Jonah. All right? Again, we're familiar with the story of Jonah, but let's look at it. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, to the great city of Nineveh, and preach against it, because its wickedness has come before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. Sorry, my book is, my Bible page is all here. Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for the port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. What are the things you observed in that?
Jonah ran away.
Jonah ran away.
Times are tough. Gotta get out of here.
Got to get out of here. Time to run. Go. Anything else?
He did not want to do it.
He didn't want to do it. What else do you notice?
He's disobedient
Disobedient to who?
to the Lord.
The Lord. So we know that God has instructed him, that God instructed Moses. Yes, right? Don't tell Moses where people go, right? Jonah, he's saying, go where? Go to Nineveh and preach against it. Tell them what I'm going to do. I don't want to do it. So he up and goes the other direction. God has given us the great commandment to love others as He loved us, basically, right? Love as I loved you. He says in John 7:15, I've given you a new commandment, love as I loved you. So, in Matthew 28, He tells us to go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them. We've been given a commission as well. Just some things to think about. We're talking about Jonah's in trouble because he's not doing what God said to do. Just, okay? You ever not want to do what God wanted? What are some things God has asked you to do that you not want to do? Maybe it was a move. Maybe it was talk to somebody. Maybe it was help someone. What's that?
To forgive someone.
Forgive someone. Yeah, that's hard to do sometimes. Praying for people that persecute you is hard to do. Loving your enemy the way Christ loved us is hard to do. Being a living sacrifice, in other words, living for Him instead of myself, is hard to do. And so we're getting an example here in the story where Jonah, unlike Moses, chooses to go another way.
Moses tried to.
He tried in talking to him, right? But he ultimately, when he left the bush, he left being faithful, right? I'm going to do what you asked me to do. But early on, he's like, I don't want to. At least he was honest. I don't want to do this. But okay. And then later on, we see a different part of Moses says, look, I can't go unless you go with us. You got to go with us. But Jonah's not doing that. Jonah's getting a direct word from God and choosing to go the other way. So my question that proceeds out of that, why would somebody refuse to back up? Why would a follower of God, a believer in God, a prophet of God, why would he refuse to disobey God? Refuse to obey God?
The book says later on that Jonah told God, I knew that if I went and preached to him, they'd repent and he wouldn't destroy them. So he really wanted to see Nineveh destroyed.
He did, didn't he? Get what they deserve. What'd you say?
He said, look at where he was going. Tough city.
Yeah, tough city. Don't want to go there. Anybody know the crime rate for New Iberia? 34%. You have a 1 in 16 chance of being a victim of a crime in this community. 1 in 16 chance of being a victim of a crime in our city. But does any anybody think it's as bad as Nineveh?
I don't think so.
Certain neighborhoods you might not want to walk in. You might not want to walk into Miss Janine's house at 3 o'clock in the morning because you're liable to get shot. Right, Miss Janine? I mean, I say that tongue in cheek. My nephew in Houston, our nephew, was sleeping last Tuesday, and he woke up with somebody in his room. And it scared him to death. But they do pest control on Tuesdays. And their maintenance guy was going through all of them, and he was sleeping because he works nights and didn't realize he was coming in. He woke up with a guy in his room. I jokingly, but also seriously said he's lucky that Houston's not a gun carrier and who had a rough night and wake up and, and I think it was Jennifer had a gun pointed at Mike one time, right? When he came in late. It happens. So yeah. Okay? So the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it because its wickedness has come before me. Right? So in Jeremiah, when he talks about what? If my people who are called by my name will return to me, then I will heal their land. What's the implication about the land and the people? They're all his. What else? Making a connection back to verse 1 and 2 here. They're wicked. God's people have become wicked. They had turned from him and were pursuing other gods and kind of doing their own thing. God was no longer first. God was no longer their king. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa where he found a ship bound for the port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed to Tarshish to flee from the Lord. In other words, he's paying money to get away. I want to get away so bad, I'm going to pay for this boat. I'm going to keep going as far as I can. Why do you suppose he did that instead of just saying, no, I'm not going to go? You ever felt like you could run from God? Or maybe know you can hide from God, like he doesn't see what your thoughts are, what your hopes are, what your dreams are, the good and the bad? We see in Scripture time and time again that God knows the hearts of his people. To the Pharisees, knowing what they were thinking, that he would speak on it, right? Now Jonah's running. He's paying to get away. He doesn't want to go. You nailed it earlier. The people are wicked. He doesn't want to go there. He wants them to be punished. The people in our culture, in our society, want other people to have to pay for what they've done. To get theirs. Anybody ever hurt you or offended you that you're like, you know what, I hope they get theirs in the end? God says to forgive them. It's hard, isn't it? God says to love them. God says turn the other cheek. And when we don't do that, we're not any different than Jonah as far as running away from what God has called us to do. So what's an area where, if you're not careful, you can find yourself heading in the wrong direction? In other words, going somewhere contrary to where God's calling you. Examples were something professionally, relationally, emotionally, or spiritually.
I mean, I've shared this numerous times, but our whole move to New Iberia was not because we wanted to be in his church, technically.
Right.
It was to help Kim's dad with his mom. And little did we know, a month before we moved here, she went in a nursing home. So it's like what we thought our plan was. 6 months later, she died.
God had a different
So
plan.
God had a different plan.
Absolutely. What I want to stop here and get at, there's a storm in your life, and you're wanting God to turn things around. It might be the time's not right. Israel was in prison, enslaved for 400 years because the sin of the Canaanites had not reached its completion, to where God was going to bring judgment. Remember those passages we read in the past in the Bible? You guys have studied those things. It wasn't time yet. So sometimes the wait for the turnaround is it's not God's timing. Sometimes it's we disobey God. We go our own direction. And God's not going to turn it around until we choose to turn around. Sometimes we're in the midst of a mess because we choose to. So do you have a safe person to confide in when you find yourself heading in the wrong direction? I'm not going to ask you to name who it is in here today. But do you have somebody that you can go to and say, you know what, I think I've been going the wrong way. I need to have somebody I can share some struggles with, some things, confess some things, like James says in James chapter 5, confess your sins to one another, and you'll be healed. Right? Do you have somebody that you can go to? That you can talk to, that can help carry that burden? Because Ecclesiastes writer says, right, what? A band of 3 chords not even broken. It's getting in there. God, somebody else, and you working together to help change and make a new direction in life. And so, we're going to wrap up this. I'm going to say a couple of things as we're leaving. Oops. There we go. It's real easy in life to want to turn around. I don't think I've met, including myself, ever met anybody that doesn't want God to turn some things around. And there are some things, like parting the Red Sea, that only God can do. Right? Only God can do that. Only God's going to stop the Jordan River from flowing. Only God's going to bring the dead back to life. Return it. But a lot of what we struggle with are choices and the result of those choices. Sometimes those choices are great. We didn't see it coming. We ended up being part of a great church home, a good family in our life. We raised a family here. Other times we make choices that bite us in the rear end. Like, what in the world? So because you know the story, like I said, I'm just filling in today because my dad does doing it, Jeremiah with you guys. You get to a place in life where you got to stop and take an inventory. Am I following where God's called me to follow? Is God my king? Or is Biden and Trump my king? Who's my first allegiance to? Do I expect them to change it? Or do I expect God to change things? Because man has proven over and over and over again throughout history that his ways don't last. Man's ways. They all, even when we're doing good, our ways are not God's ways. We think we're doing good sometimes and we may not be. You ever tried to help somebody but help them and you hurt? I have. There were times in my life my dad could have done some things for me that would have helped me at the time, but I wouldn't have learned the lesson I needed to learn. And it helped me to grow. So we want God to turn things around in our families, in our own lives, in our community, in our country. We need to start with an inventory about where we are and how we got there. And then compare that to what God has to say. Okay, now what do I do with it? It always starts with a choice. Always starts with a choice. Thank y'all. You better turn off the light.
Just that I had
Are you over here?
Too cold.
I was pretty good the last couple of days, or Friday, and said,
That's how you're
I
going to
guess you're
stop.
not gonna be teaching.
Good morning.